thoughts about situations and behaviors to try and a lot of times trying to get more food. And so that's one of my favorite things about polar bears is how smart they are.
And Evan, does their intelligence, it must help them when they're out on the sea ice trying to find seals in a really bare-looking landscape. They have to figure out where to get their next meal?
Absolutely, and they have this ability to remember where they found food in the past and get back to similar places year after year. We find bears, we'll go back to the same sand spit on the coast of Hudson Bay here year after year after year, and obviously that requires the ability to navigate, but also to remember where they've been. And so yes, they're extremely intelligent animals.
Right, and that very nicely takes us to number 9. Jan, we were talking to you, and that was one of your favorite things about polar bears, their ability to navigate and find themselves in the same place, even with drifting ice and all these other things.
Yeah, because we have some polar bears that might walk hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And what is fascinating then is that if you put a collar on the bear so you can follow actually where they're walking, you see that they do get back to exactly the same place. So they might be, half a year away from home and then they get back. And even if the sea ice is drifting a lot, it might be pitch dark for several months up in the high Arctic. And you can see that they take a route back that brings them back to exactly the same place.
Wow.
And you have to remember that the sea ice could drift in very different directions from day to day with storms and everything, but they always know where they are.
And do we have any idea how they always know? Is it some sort of magnetism, or I've even heard the stars, which I'm not sure if that's right.
I think it's a lot of things you don't know about animal migration, but those things are things that they think are important, and that's both magnetism and where the stars are and so on. So it's probably a combination of things that make them find back.
Yeah.
But it's still some sort of a mystery. It's tricky.
Yeah.
You should try yourself, and it's we get lost on a pretty small scale if you don't have good clues. If you're out today with fog or when it's dark or something, you get lost fast. But those guys, they are able to navigate.
That's so incredible. I know I get turned around on these tundra buggy trails all the time, and they're not that big of an area that we travel around on out here, and they're old military trails. They're set in the road same year after year, and I still get turned around all the time. And for polar bears to walk that maybe thousands of kilometers and find themselves back where they started is pretty incredible. And another very incredible thing that we see here, and not all across the polar bear range, only in certain areas, is the type of play that we sometimes see them do. And Jeff was going to talk about that.
Yeah, it's really cool here in Western Hudson Bay. It's also seen sometimes on Wrangel Island in Russia, but basically places where polar bears congregate, and male polar bears in particular. It's long thought that polar bears are antisocial animals. They're these solitary bears that roam the ice alone, but in fact they can be quite social depending on the setting, and this is one of them, where the guys are ashore, there's really not any food of interest, they're not chasing mates, and so that allows them to be less competitive. And this time of year, as it's getting colder and freezing up, we'll see males sort of do what we call sparring or play fighting with one another. It can be very dramatic to watch, even though they're just hitting basically with open paws most of the time there. And I mean, we think it has something to do with establishing hierarchy safely and just practicing for when they're out on the ice in the spring and they're fighting for real.
Okay, so yeah, a little bit of a practice fight, just as people would maybe wrestle with their friends or even siblings in a way and figure out where they stand before things get real.
And here sometimes we've seen large adult mature male bears try to coax over young sub-adult bears who usually say absolutely not.
Well, that's smart of them. So polar bears are sometimes solitary, sometimes around other bears here, but of course pregnant females have cubs, and one of the very, very cool things that pregnant females, especially in this area, do is go for long periods of time with no food, and maybe Evan could give us more information about that.
So yeah, I mean, polar bears are adapted to living in the Arctic environment and going for periods without food. Sometimes it's weeks between the time a polar bear kills one seal and gets another seal. So they have this really amazing fasting endurance. But the ability to go without food the prize goes to adult females. So in this particular part of the world, adult females will become pregnant out on the sea ice in April and May, and then they'll come ashore in early June, and they'll stay on shore till the following March. And so they go up to 8 months without food in this part of the Canadian Arctic. You can imagine how hungry you get when you miss a meal on a given day, or even 2 meals. These bears go without food for 8 months, and during that time they go into dens, and obviously they reduce their amount of activity, but they lose about almost half their body mass. And while they're doing this, they're giving birth to their cubs. They're also producing milk for their cubs, so their cubs can grow inside the dens. And so this is just an amazing adaptive feature of these animals to go 3/4 of a year without having anything to eat, and that's really special about polar bears.
And polar bear milk is extra fatty, isn't that right? That helps the cubs grow very quickly.
Yeah, most marine mammal milk has a very high fat content, and polar bears are included in that group. And so when their cubs are born, they're only about a pound and a half, but over the course of just 3 short months, those cubs will grow from a pound and a half to almost 20 pounds. So that's a really special, rich, nutritious milk that those cubs are getting to grow so quickly.
Very cool. And that brings us very nicely to the next point. So number 5, a really cool thing that Jeff will talk about, is the diet that they eat. It's very different from their closest relative, the brown bear, and, well, from a lot of other carnivores. They're not, as big meat eaters as you might think, really.
Yeah, polar bears really have grown to specialize on marine mammal fat, seal fat, and that's why they can live where they do and are so successful at being in what to us seems like this frozen and desolate place. To them, it's a place that's rich in life. It's just the life is underneath the sea ice where we can't see it so easily, but it's manifested as these plump, fat seals, whether they be ring seals at about 150 pounds or bearded seals that are easily 2 to 3 times that amount of weight, and a significant bit of that is fat or blubber in the case of seals.
Wow. And so some people ask the question, can polar bears adapt to live on land? Can they live off eggs and caribou? Is that possible for the polar bear?
Well, certainly polar bears eat all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
They're scavengers when they're on shore. They're opportunists in that sense. The calories that those things have just aren't what they need. They need that marine mammal fat and a lot of it to get themselves through the winter, or as Evan was saying, to get through reproduction in a den after they've been fasting.
Right.
For so long. So they're really keyed in physiologically and even genetically. We've had recent studies that show, how they've evolved at that level to metabolize fat very efficiently.
And how many seals does a polar bear need to eat to be healthy?
It depends on the seal. We always used to say 1 every 8 days or something around that, but again, because seals are quite different in size, and if you add juvenile seals to that too, they're extremely different in size. The juvenile seal would be more of like a chicken McNugget to a polar bear probably, whereas a bearded seal would get them through for quite a while.
Okay. And we sometimes hear that this springtime polar bears go through something called hyperphagia. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. So it's a period of gorging. Polar bears, no different, are able to eat a great deal of food at one particular time, and then, as again Evan mentioned with pregnant females, same for males, they can then store that food as fat and go through these long periods of fasting. So they're able to become quite obese yet stay very healthy and not have the issues or complexities with obesity that we would have.
Right. Yeah, it's a different situation for polar bears and body fat
Absolutely.
for sure. So we do have a question, and maybe Evan, I'll pop it over to you. Are polar bears becoming more violent amongst themselves? For example, are males cannibalizing cubs more often, or do you see much of that?
So we have seen some more observations of cannibalism, particularly here in Hudson Bay in the last 5 to 10 years. There's been observations of males predating and eating small cubs. We've also seen observations of cannibalism in the Beaufort Sea, and so in that particular area, researchers have worked there for over 35 years, close to 40 years, and only recently has there been a number of documented cases of cannibalism and infanticide in that particular part of the world. And so we don't know if there's an increasing trend at a global scale, but in some regions it does appear to becoming a little bit more prevalent.
Thanks for that. Interesting. Okay, so thank you for your questions. Please keep sending them in, questions@pbears.org, or you can tweet at Polar Bears or use hashtag Tundra Connections if you're using Twitter today. So the next cool thing, so what do we have so far? So number 10, how smart polar bears are. Number 9, how they can spar around this area, they play fight. Number 8, how they can navigate so amazingly. They can go all over the world and come back to the same spot year after year. We have how they eat fat. All right, so Jan, let's go over to you. One of the really cool things about polar bears is what massive distances they travel, both by walking and swimming. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, first, as maybe most people already know, is that they are able to really walk far. So they can walk from one place in Arctic to another one. You have bears that have walked from like West Greenland over to Russia, Asian part of Russia, and you've had from Alaska and almost to the North Pole and down to Greenland. So you have some really long migrations, and we do see that in most populations, that they walk hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And they also have this ability to do this steady trot. So when you have collars on, you can follow them, and you see that they just walk and walk and walk. And it's not they're walking very fast. It's just that they're just keeping up walking all the time.
Yeah.
So they can do, many tens of kilometers every day over several days.
Wow. Oh, and we've got someone walking just outside the window here. You can keep talking on.
So
We'll
that's
get
just
the
to
camera
show
on it.
what we meant, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly. The bear wants to illustrate for everybody.
Yeah, so just see, it's not very fast, but it's just
Right.
walking and walking.
And they'll just keep going and going.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so nice. And they can also do that with swimming, is that right? They can swim for very long distances.
That's true, and this is something that we learned. It's something we have known earlier, that they actually can swim long distances because you capture them one place and then you recapture them somewhere else across big distances of water. But when we have collars on, those can also measure when they have been in the water, and then you see that they actually can swim for many days. And of course, when they're swimming, they don't eat, they just swim and swim and swim.
Wow.
And another fascinating thing with that is that the water is often very cold. So they
course,
swim in ice-covered waters,
Wow.
or where it's close to ice, and it might be like -1 degrees maybe in the water, and they are able to do that for many days without getting too cold.
Wow. And how do cubs handle that, being so much smaller?
Cubs actually are not likely to handle that well if they are
Yeah.
young. And even if they're like a bit older, like a year old, they probably cool down much faster than adult bears, because it's the hair is really the good insulation in air, but in water it's the blubber, like the fat layer that actually
Okay.
insulate the bear, and that is not thick on small cubs. They hardly have any fat at all. And that means that small cubs won't survive long in cold water. And thus you also see that females in small cubs, they don't like open water.
Right. So even though polar bears can be excellent swimmers, it's not always the ideal situation for them. Very interesting. You can see on the polar bear cam here, we've got at least a bear bum. The bear is just inside the view of the camera here, so we'll see if she keeps on walking. And I should say we don't know for sure if it's a male or female. We'd have to get a lot closer, but I'll call her a she for the moment as she pokes around. We'll just keep talking about polar bears and see what she does. So I was going to maybe talk a little bit about paws, because those are one of my favorite things about polar bears. Polar bears have really interesting feet, and we'll let you keep watching this bear out here, but we have a fake foot if she gets out of our view. Polar bear paws are so well adapted for the Arctic. There's a few different things about them that are just really interesting. Of course, they're furry, keeps them nice and warm. And you probably know already, even if you've never seen a polar bear in real life, you can tell by photos that their feet are huge. They've got very big paws. Part of the reason for this is to distribute their weight across a larger area. And having their heavy weight spread over 4 large paws makes it easier for them to walk across thinner ice. Now, sea ice being a little bit salty, the way it freezes makes it a little bit more bendy than your average lake ice. So a heavy polar bear can spread its weight out and actually shuffle across pretty thin ice, which is kind of a neat thing. Polar bears, of course, have very sharp, curved claws, Mostly used for hunting seals, of course, but doesn't hurt for a little bit of grip on the ice. And they have paws that are almost kind of sticky, so they have what we call papillae on the pads of their feet. Gives them a bit of grip in really icy conditions. And winter tire companies, or at least one winter tire company, has actually used the polar bear paw as a model for maybe how to improve their tires. That's pretty cool. Another neat thing about polar bear feet that ties into maybe navigation and intelligence is that they can have smelly feet and find each other with their smelly footprints. And in particular, this is when females are ready to mate in the spring. They release a certain scent through their footprints that males are able to pick up, and males will actually lock on to smelly footprints and follow a female for a very, very long time in order to find her out in the middle of the sea ice. So lots of really cool things about polar bear paws. Of course, they're so well adapted to the Arctic in so many ways, but I just think it's neat that there's so many cool things to talk about for feet. I feel like human feet aren't as interesting, but I'm sure a podiatrist would disagree with me. Okay, another cool thing about feet, of course, is that they can be used for swimming, which we've kind of talked about. But in particular, Jan was really interested in their diving ability, and it's just fascinating how well they dive.
Yeah, that's also true. I don't think we knew like 20 years ago or something how good they actually were to dive. But what we've seen, again, using colors, and you have sensors there that can actually measure how deep they dive. And we found out that it's not uncommon that polar bears dive below 10 meters.
Wow.
And up to 14 meters is the one we had that has
14
been
meters.
diving deepest. And they don't do this all the time, but they do it from time to time. And what they do is at least two different things. They dive to find kelp on the bottom that they for some reason eat, that we actually don't know. And what we do know that why they eat is seals, as already Jeff has told. And we know that they also dive in between flows of ice that often might stick several meters underneath the water. And they dive underneath those ice flows when they see a seal, and then they suddenly come up with some speed and almost jump out of the water and take the seal.
Wow. Oh, very cool. Very interesting. And it's neat that they dive for kelp where you are. And we often see these bears here when they're on land at this time of year. They'll lay in some of the kelp beds around here and just eat their bed, basically. They eat their kelp during the day. It's really interesting to watch. It's like a polar bear salad or something. But I'm sure they'd rather have a seal, but it's good that there's something to snack on.
We do have a clip of a polar bear hunting a bearded seal.
Let's do it. Yeah. So BJ is going to play a clip here, and I think, Jan, this is probably somewhat similar to what you're explaining. Oh, maybe, yeah. So sneaking up from out of the water, trying to ambush a seal. Maybe we can play that one more time. Pretty neat stuff. All right. Well, maybe not. That's okay. Thanks, BJ, for showing that. That's perfect. Well, maybe we'll take a quick question. We've got a couple here that are really interesting. Evan, I'm going to shoot this one over to you. Have polar bears from other subpopulations begun to migrate into this area? And if they have, does this cause more problems for finding food?
That's a very good question, and so a lot of what we've been talking about today from different research we've done is satellite tracking and being able to show how polar bears dive and move around the Arctic and how they navigate. And so from all of our collar data from working in a lot of different populations and adjacent populations here in western Hudson Bay, we really haven't seen any long-term emigration of polar bears between subpopulations. Polar bears, when they're with their mothers, they learn to hunt and live in particular areas. They learn to where to go for food, and so really it's not adaptive for them to just pick up and move to a new place because they don't know where to find food. It's energetically costly to move to another place, and could ultimately influence their survival. And so we know from genetics and return of tags, when polar bears with tags get turned in, and movements of individuals with GPS collars, all those things suggest that there hasn't really been huge shifts in polar bears between subpopulations. So we don't really think the competitive landscape for polar bears has really changed that much. Bears just tend to live in the area that they're in and try and do the best that they can with what's available to them in their what we call their home ranges.
Oh, thanks for answering that, Evan. It seems like polar bears sometimes have different strategies for things. Jeff, do polar bears have different personalities?
Yes, we think they do, and as much as we know what they're thinking, but just behaviorally looking at polar bears and some of the things they do, we see a lot of individual difference. An example, I think, that paints the picture well is denning females. Using Alaska as another sub example, is most females want to den in snow caves that are far away from any activity, both bear activity but also human activity. However, there are some females, we've had 4 now, that have denned right in the middle of the oil and gas industrial footprint
Bizarre.
in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. Last year we had a female choose to den right next to a metal bridge adjacent to a production facility that was quite busy, and we're talking
Strange.
heavy industry. Most bears would want nothing to do with that. That's where she chose to den. She found good snow. She successfully had a cub and went on her way. So you do see differences in individual choice. The same is true here in the viewing area. There are bears like the one that just walked by us who clearly don't seem too concerned that we're here.
Right.
There are other bears sometimes we'll see at a distance that want nothing to do with the human activity they see over here, and it's very easy for them to avoid us.
Interesting. So just like people, polar bears, there's just variation
Yeah.
in how they want to do things. So very interesting. So let's move on to the next favorite thing. So one cool thing about polar bears, of course we see them out here and they're very large, but they start at a very different size. And Evan, could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, polar bears actually start off very small relative to the size of their mother. So an adult female polar bear that might weigh, over 400 pounds gives birth to a cub that's only, a pound and a half. They're about the size of a Labrador Retriever puppy when they're born. So extremely small cubs for the size of the females, but they grow really fast. And so cubs are born in dens in the end of December and beginning of January. They're only a pound and a half. But over the next 3 months, they'll grow to about 20 pounds before they leave the den. And so they have very fast growth rates. Polar bears are also size dimorphic species, so females grow about half as long as the males do. Females reach their adult body size at around 5 years of age, but the males grow for another 4 or more years until about 9 or 10 years of age. And so the males get larger because they actually have to fight and contest to get access to females in the mating system. And so polar bears start off very small, but they end up being the largest land carnivore that we know of.
So polar bears must have pretty good moms then to get them from tiny babies to big adults. Could you talk a bit about how amazing polar bear mothers are with teaching their cubs how to do everything, basically?
Yeah, I mean, so polar bear mothers invest very heavily in their offspring. Even though they have small cubs, they produce milk for them for at least the first year and a half, and do continue to feed them and produce milk for the cubs into their second year of life. But during those 2 years, polar bear cubs are learning from their mothers. They're learning how to hunt seals. They're learning different areas to go to at different times of the year to find food. They're learning how to interact with other bears, what bears to avoid, things to be curious about, and things to be aware of in the environment. And so it's really important that those cubs have those 2 years with their moms, because after 2.5 years, those cubs will split up from their mother, and then they're on their own. And for most of the rest of their lives, they'll be solitary, and so they'll have to take what they learned from their mothers and apply that to make a living and to survive in the Arctic environment.
So it must be hard with all these changes that are happening in the Arctic sea ice over time. These changes do happen over a decade or so. But if cubs are taught one thing by their moms, if the sea ice is this way, we do things this way. If the sea ice changes, that must be hard for cubs to adjust if they're quite young out there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we see huge changes from year to year in the environment, we see that the bears have a harder time. So when things all of a sudden change very drastically in one direction or the other, it probably makes it harder for bears to make a living.
Makes sense. Which brings us to our final favorite thing about polar bears, just how cool it is that they have this crazy, icy, cold habitat. Maybe Jeff could talk a bit more about that.
Sure, and I think it gets back to a little bit what probably several of us have said today, but when you come out onto the Arctic sea ice for the first time, from our perspective, it doesn't look like a place that would have any life at all. It seems frozen and it seems empty. And again, it's because so much of the activity that's happening out there is happening out of our sight. It's in the ocean water, it's underneath the sea ice. And polar bears, if you think of it, are really the manifestation of this really productive environment. You need a lot of productivity to result in the largest land carnivore being on top of the sea ice. So it's pretty cool when you're out there to suddenly see this large, healthy, majestic polar bear, like the one that's been sleeping next to us and the one that walked right by us.
Yep. Oh, it looks like this guy's just perked up a bit when you talked about him. Might have heard you.
Excellent. He's up.
Oh, we're gonna get the cam on him in just a minute, maybe. Yeah, it's a pretty special habitat out there on the Arctic sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It grows the food that powers that whole food chain up to the polar bear, and it's pretty neat. And the hard thing about sea ice, of course, is that it's hard to protect in the moment. So in things like a forest, for example, if we want to protect a forest, we can plant more trees, we could put a fence around it, we could even hire people to patrol the forest. But with sea ice, it's really a global conservation issue that we can all work on together, no matter where we live, but we do have to do it now. Jeff, do you mind talking for a moment about how everyone can help protect sea ice and polar bears?
Sure. So the biggest threat to sea ice is a warming environment, a warming atmosphere, and the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet right now. So we need to use less fossil fuel. We need to burn less fossil fuel for energy. We can do that through just using less to begin with, and by using it more efficiently, and also by choosing cleaner sources and renewable sources of power there. And you can help all of us transition to that just by making personal choices at home, at school, in your workplace, but by also talking to your friends, your family, talking to your coworkers. And what's really important increasingly for all of us is to communicate with our elected representatives if we live in countries where that's possible. And we vote for representatives that accept science and use science to inform wise policy. We need that today more than ever.
Absolutely. And our friend just out the window there decided to lay back down after thinking he was going to stand up for a minute, but I think he's going to continue his nap. So thank you, Jeff, for talking about how we can all protect polar bears together. And so we're going to start the wrap up, but I wanted to run through this list pretty quickly here, just so you have our top 10 favorite things. This might not be in the exact order we talked about them because we did jump around a bit. We couldn't really rank them. We tried to rank them, but these are all cool. So how smart polar bears are, how they spar in this area, so play fighting, how they can walk and swim for incredibly long distances. Pregnant females can go for up to 8 months without eating. Polar bears like to eat fat. That's their favorite food. They need blubber, seal blubber, to consume as many calories as possible. That's pretty cool. How they are amazing at navigation and can walk for thousands of kilometers and find themselves back in pretty much the exact same spot. I wish I had that ability. How great their paws are. They're huge, they're furry, they're smelly. They're very well adapted for what a polar bear needs on the sea ice. They are incredible divers. They can dive up to 14 meters deep. Incredibly cool. They're so tiny when they're born, and they grow so big, and they have excellent mothers to help them along those steps. And they need sea ice. They need this habitat that we can't really control directly, but we can absolutely have positive influence on it and protect it in the Arctic always. So polar bears are pretty special animals, and I think we all feel pretty lucky that we get to work on them and get to talk to people about them. And so we'd like to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. And let's all just remember that there's a lot of things we can do to help polar bears. If you are interested in helping polar bears, please check out our website at polarbearsinternational.org. We've got options no matter whether you're in kindergarten or you're a full-grown adult. And if you're a student, also please check out our Project Polar Bear, our school contest to reduce carbon emissions in your classroom or community. Lots of interesting opportunities there. And if you watched today and would like to give feedback, we'd really appreciate it. So check out our feedback survey on our website. Everyone who enters will be put into a draw to win a polar bear adoption. And we just wanted to thank Wirecast for this software that allowed us to come to you today and mix in the polar bear cam. And of course, we would like to thank Quark Expeditions for being such an excellent sponsor and such good stewards of the environment. And thank you for watching us today, for joining, and for liking polar bears. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks to our panel, and hopefully we'll see you soon throughout all of this bear season.